Welcome back to Cars and Stories. Today I want to talk to you guys about the second vehicle that I purchased in my large array of cars that I've owned so far. 2 years into ownership of the Jetta, the motor actually blew, so it was dead, and I looked into replacing it, but at that time I was really looking for something just a little bit nicer, a little bit cooler, um, that had more options. So I had spent quite a few times going to junkyards and trying to source parts for the Jetta, whether it was just miscellaneous plastic parts or hoses. And there was this one particular junkyard that I would go to that had used cars kind of lined up in the parking area where customers would pull up. And I think it was just one of those situations where they would take a car in and they saw that it was something that they could easily fix and clean up and then put it on the lot and try to make a profit there. So, it's a great business model for them. With me not having a ton of money at the time, more than $400 that I had for my Jetta, but still not a lot. I think I probably had like 2 grand, 2 grand the most. I had decided to go to the junkyard and check these cars out. So as I'm walking down the aisle, I spot this red coupe that has a spoiler and a sunroof, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like this looks really cool. So of course it's a manual, which is great. By this time, I would say, a very competent manual driver at that point. So I asked them to test drive it, take it for a test drive. Car feels great. I'm so excited. It has this little badge on the back that says turbo, and I'm like, oh, okay. I'm like, that seems cool. But at the time, I was just more excited that it had AC, that it had a spoiler, that it was red. It had an electronic like power sliding and tilt sunroof, which I was like, this is an upgrade for me. So I think they were asking like $2,300, and I offered them, it was either like $1,500 or $1,700, and they agreed, and I was so excited. I was like, oh my gosh, my second car is so much cooler than my first one. I have AC that actually works, and I was over the moon. But my first 2 weeks of ownership were an absolute nightmare. So it drove fine on the test drive. There was no issues. And the first time I encountered an issue, I was just kind of driving and went to go get on the highway and punched it, and the car started to feel like it was misfiring and then ultimately died. I would put the car over, throw it in neutral, and put over to the side of the road, try to restart the car, and it wouldn't restart. So I had to have it towed back to the junkyard where I was like, you guys are going to fix this. You sold me this car. Like, you guys need to figure out what's going on. So thank goodness for AAA, because this happened twice where I brought it back to them and they would look at it, they would keep it for a day, and would call me and say, hey, listen, the car's starting, it's fine. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, it's good. And I'm like, well, it obviously died and it had to be towed in. Did you guys go through it? Yes, we went through it. The car's fine. It's good to go. So after going through that twice, when it happened a third time, I was fed up. So I brought it to a family friend who was a mechanic that really knew cars well. And he looked at the car for, it may have been like 5 minutes, and he was like, I see your problem. Essentially, what the junkyard had done was they had there was a rubber boot that goes into the intake that it's basically a boost hose, and essentially the junkyard had wrapped duct tape around it to seal it, as opposed to just buying a new boot, which was outrageous. So the mechanic's like, yep, this is your issue right here. Once you get this fixed, like, everything else seems to be in order. So I said, okay, cool. So I ordered the boot. It was a $60 part from Mazda. Put the boot on, and the car absolutely woke up. Now at that time, I didn't know much about turbos and how they worked. I knew that the car looked cool, and that's essentially why I bought it. So when I started doing research into turbos and seeing how the boost comes on and how it's a additional power adder, I was blown away. I was like, oh my gosh, this is really phenomenal. Now, the 1988 Mazda MX-6 is not a really well-known car compared to like the Supras and the RX-7s, and even like the Eclipse, which those were known as the heyday cars. This car was really impressive for what it was. And for being an 18-year-old kid having a manual coupe, I was really proud of this car. Car and Driver had tested the car and it achieved a 7-second 0 to 60, which at that time was fast. The car weighed 2,900 pounds. It sat 5 people, 4 to 5 people, and it had just really unique, cool features. It had the center vents actually oscillated like a fan. So you push a button and they would just automatically move back and forth to heat or cool the front passengers, which I thought was really phenomenal. And I loved having the full power sunroof, which was awesome. The only issue with the sunroof is to put it in the tilt position. Sometimes you just had to give it a little push because um, the rubber seal would just catch on the body. But other than that, it was fine. The AC worked, and I loved it. So I affectionately named this car the Soldier, and it was the first car that I'd really taken to doing modifications on. When I first bought the car, it was essentially just stock, and it sat like a 4x4. I mean, there was so much fender gap in this car. It was crazy. So one of the first things I did was I was like, I'm going to lower this car. And as an 18-year-old with not a lot of money, what do? You decide to cut the springs. I had read a couple things on forums that you can cut the springs to get the lower ride height, and I was like, okay, cool. So I went to the shop that I worked at. We removed all the struts and springs, cut the springs, put it back on, and success. The car was low, it was great, but it was the worst decision I could have made because the ride was absolutely horrible. I think I didn't even last 2 weeks before I was ordering a set of ground control coilovers because the ride was so awful. It was dangerous. I was literally like, I hit a bump and it was just bouncing, bouncing, bouncing. And I was like, this is just not gonna work. So after putting in the ground control coilovers, the drop was effective and the ride was phenomenal. So I think I went with some Coney shocks with the ground control coilovers, and so now I had achieved the stance and the ride quality, which was amazing. Then the next modification I made was an exhaust. It was too quiet. I wanted something a little deeper, not loud and obnoxious, but definitely a better tone. So I did a lot of research and I came across the Tanube exhaust, which they said stayed under a certain decibel. I think it was like 92 decibels. But it had a nice deep throaty sound, and I listened to a bunch of videos and I'm like, this is the one I'm gonna do. So I installed that exhaust, loved the tone, loved the sound. It was enough noise to not be obnoxious, but to have a quality sound. So I really enjoyed that. And I think my favorite modification that I did to the car was a blow-off valve. So at the time, I had worked as a valet down in the North End, and I had valeted this one Mitsubishi Eclipse GSX, which was, I could tell, was modified. And when I went to go park the car pulled like a beast. Nothing like my MX-6 did, but I remember just going to shift gears and this whistle sound that was like, and I was like, oh my gosh, I was like, I need this. So I did a ton of research, and I had found that if you put a blow-off valve on the car, it could mess with the ECU because the ECU needs that air to be recirculated back in. And when it's being vented to the atmosphere, it can mess with the air-fuel ratio. So Go Fast Bits actually made a blow-off valve where it would recirculate some of the air, but also vent some of the air to the atmosphere. So I was loving that. One of my favorite mods that I did to the car. Probably bought the car with about 120,000 miles on it and ended up selling it to my freshman college roommate in my senior year in college. And it was running perfect when I sold it to him, but 6 months into ownership, he actually ended up totaling it, unfortunately. But I did end up buying another Mazda MX-6 a couple years later, a black one that was heavily modified, but the Soldier will always be my favorite. So thanks for subscribing. Thank you for watching. And my next video will be touching on the first car that I ever financed.